The year is 1915. Italy, drawn into the maelstrom of the Great War, commits its forces to the Allied cause. But for the Italian High Command, the declaration of war presents a challenge that borders on the impossible: to break the defensive lines of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in perhaps the most unsuitable place for an offensive on the planet. The Alps. Here the very landscape is the enemy. Every attack becomes a bloody, vertical battle, where soldiers claw their way up sheer rock faces under the withering fire of enemy machine guns. Enemy artillery, perched on high, turns the advancing infantry into targets in a grotesque shooting gallery. The narrow mountain passes, the steep slopes, and the treacherous stony ground make every foot of progress a lethal gamble. Italian generals, watching their armies bleed against the stone, search frantically for a solution, for any innovation that could tip the scales and grant them an advantage over the entrenched enemy. By October of 1915, a secret directive arrives at the headquarters of the Fiat automobile concern. The Ministry of War has a request: design and build an armored vehicle, a machine capable of shattering the enemy's defenses and shielding the infantry from the murderous fire of Austrian guns. The company's engineers begin their work with patriotic fervor, understanding that the very outcome of the war for Italy could depend on their creation. It soon becomes clear, however, that pioneering an entirely new class of military hardware is a far more monumental task than anyone had initially imagined. The months begin to crawl by. The designers remain hunched over blueprints and calculations, wrestling with unprecedented engineering problems. The development moves so slowly that the Italian government's patience wears perilously thin. A pragmatic decision is made. They turn to the French, who already possess experience in tank production. France supplies Italy first with the heavy Schneider tank, and later the light Renault, which would form the nascent core of Italy's armored forces. While these French machines see active use at the front, the engineers at Fiat do not surrender. They continue their work, driven by a desire to create a uniquely Italian machine that would surpass anything their allies had produced. Finally, in June of 1917, the first prototype is ready for its trials. Or rather, partially ready. The chassis and mechanical systems are functional, but the superstructure is merely a wooden mock-up, its metal components not yet fabricated. Even in this unfinished state, the machine makes a stunning impression on the military observers. When the Italian creation is rolled out alongside a 6-ton French Renault, the difference is instantly, shockingly apparent. The Fiat 2000 weighs 40 tons, making it a true colossus among the tanks of the First World War. A Sekar, keen eyes can spot the differences. The first prototype's armored skirt is welded from several plates, while the second's is forged from a single, massive piece of steel. The very placement of its machine guns is also altered. It was more than a weapon. It was a declaration. A steel monster born from the desperation of a war fought in the clouds. A mechanical answer to an impossible question posed by the mountains themselves. On the initial prototype, the machine guns were placed conventionally, a predictable arrangement at the front and the rear. But the designers, driven by a more ambitious vision, soon reevaluated. In the subsequent model, these weapons were repositioned to the corners of the superstructure, a tactical decision that granted a far superior field of view and dramatically wider angles of fire. The sheer scale of this machine is something that strains the imagination, even for seasoned military specialists of the era. Its length stretched beyond 7.5 meters. Its width was a solid 3 meters, and its height soared to an intimidating almost 4'1". Contemporaries would come to know it by a fitting name: the Mobile Fortress. To put its colossal weight into perspective, one must consider the German A7V, widely regarded as the heaviest tank of the First World War. That machine tipped the scales at 33 tons. The Fiat, this Italian titan, surpassed it by a staggering 7 tons. Its armament was a direct reflection of its impressive dimensions and deserves its own careful consideration. The principal weapon of the Fiat 2000 was a 65mm howitzer, an artillery piece specifically engineered for the brutal realities of mountain warfare. This compact, powerful cannon was installed in a dome-shaped turret atop the vehicle, and it is this turret that represents a truly revolutionary leap in armored design. For the first time on such a heavy machine, the turret was capable of a full 360-degree rotation. This gave the tank the ability to engage targets in any direction without the laborious, time-consuming process of turning the entire vehicle. The gun's angle of depression was -10 degrees, while its elevation could reach an astonishing 75 degrees, allowing it to fire upon enemies in low-lying terrain or on elevated positions with equal lethality. But the engineers understood, with grim clarity, that a single howitzer was not enough to defend such a vast machine from swarms of enemy infantry. And so, the hull was perforated with numerous embrasures, into which up to 8 Fiat Revelli machine guns, chambered in 6.5mm, could be mounted. These weapons were placed in various configurations with a single, obsessive purpose: to provide all-encompassing, circular protection. They were there to ensure there were no dead zones, no blind spots through which an enemy soldier might approach the tank unnoticed. This sheer number of firing points transformed the Fiat into a true floating fortress, capable of repelling an infantry assault from any conceivable direction. The armor, by the standards of the Great War, was exceptionally solid. The thickness of the plates on the sides and rear of the hull varied from 10 to 15 millimeters, while the frontal armor reached a formidable 20 millimeters, substantially exceeding the protection offered by most of its contemporaries. The hull's design incorporated a slight upward slope, yet the angle was too shallow to be considered true sloped armor. This machine, therefore, relied not on clever geometry, but on the brute strength and sheer thickness of its steel plates to deflect enemy fire. It was designed to withstand the impact of bullets and shell fragments through sheer, unyielding mass. To operate such a beast required a small army within its steel walls. The crew was originally planned to consist of 10 men, the majority of whom were tasked with serving the bristling array of machine guns. However, military specialists soon realized that attempting to use all 8 machine guns simultaneously was not only impractical, but tactically nonsensical. It was a fantasy of firepower that had little place on a real battlefield. The Fiat 2000 was more than a tank. It was a declaration, a testament to an industrial ambition that sought to solve the bloody stalemate of the trenches with overwhelming, indivisible force. It was a vision of a future war, fought by land-bound battleships, a future that, for this magnificent, lumbering giant, would never quite arrive. The crew, a complement now reduced to a more manageable 8 men, found their places within the steel behemoth. Deep in the machine's forward section, the driver settled into his central position. His view of the world was a narrow, fractured one, seen either through the shimmering glass of a periscope or, in moments of deceptive calm, through a great hatch set into the frontal armor plate. But opening that hatch was a calculated risk, a gamble taken only far from the fighting. To do so under fire was to invite catastrophe, exposing not just the driver, but the entire crew to the enemy's direct gaze. Access to this fortress was through a single side hatch on the port hull. One by one, the men would climb inside and navigate to their stations in the cavernous fighting compartment, a space positioned directly above the engine, the transmission, and the intricate guts of the machine. This design was a quiet revolution. A thick bulkhead separated the crew from the engine bay, granting them a degree of space and maneuverability unheard of in the tanks of other nations, where men were often forced to exist in a cramped, suffocating hell of roaring machinery and fume-filled air. The heart of this land-bound battleship was a six-cylinder Fiat A12 aircraft engine, a power plant designed for the sky, now tasked with moving 40 tons of steel across the earth. It produced a respectable 250 horsepower, but its aviation pedigree came with a critical consequence. The beast ran on high-grade aviation fuel, a logistical complication that strained an already burdened supply chain. This immense mass dictated the machine's pace. On flat ground, its maximum speed was a mere 6.5 kilometers per hour, roughly the speed of a man walking at a brisk pace. Yet the military high command did not see this as a deficiency. In the doctrine of the day, tanks were not yet the independent, lightning-fast weapons of a future war. They were infantry support platforms, mobile pillboxes designed to crawl forward with the foot soldier. Their purpose was to absorb bullets, to silence enemy machine gun nests, and to shield the advancing infantry with their hardened steel hides. The tank's speed needed only to match the tempo of the men it was sworn to protect. The ability to move any faster than an advancing soldier was considered a superfluous luxury. For this grim, grinding work, 6 kilometers per hour was deemed entirely sufficient. But all these impressive specifications and innovative solutions could not mask a fatal, creeping problem. The tank's development had taken far too long. The Fiat 2000, a machine conceived for one war, now risked arriving at a textbook example of how ambitious theory shatters against the unforgiving anvil of reality. The tank was simply too large, too ponderous for the specific war it was meant to fight. The Italian army was not fighting on the open plains of France. Its war was waged in the narrow, treacherous mountain passes of the Alps. Here the roads were little more than serpentine trails blasted from sheer rock, paths whose width often measured only a few meters. Into this labyrinth, the 40-ton colossus could not physically go. It was a leviathan trapped in a bottle, unable to navigate the very mountain routes where the most decisive battles between Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces were being fought. As the second prototype remained unfinished well into February of 1918, the Allied armies were already preparing for the final decisive offensive. The clock had run out. The great machine, born of immense effort and national pride, had become a monument to an idea whose time had already passed, a steel ghost haunting a war it could never truly join. The final great Allied offensive was gathering steam, an unstoppable force meant to at last break the will of the Central Powers. But for one Italian behemoth, the war was already over. It was becoming painfully obvious that the tank, the mighty Fiat 2000, would not fulfill the grand hopes that had been placed upon its colossal chassis. On the 4th of November, 1918, the program was officially terminated. The timing was almost cruelly ironic. This decision was made just a few short days before the signing of the armistice that would finally end the fighting. Italy had spent 3 long years designing and developing a machine for a war that it would never fight. A steel giant born for a conflict that had already left it behind. The story of the second prototype, however, was not quite finished. The military command decided to send the vehicle to the Piave River, the very same ground where the Austro-Hungarian army had recently launched its last desperate offensive against Italy. Officially, it was there for field trials, but no credible evidence of its participation in any real combat action. Exact formidable display of its cross-country performance and the reliability of its mechanisms in conditions that merely approximated battle. A ghost haunting a fresh grave. With the end of the First World War, any further production of the Fiat 2000 was, of course, out of the question. The two completed prototypes would remain the only examples of this ambitious family of tanks, and the military command saw little reason to order new ones. The machine had proven to be too specialized, too complex, and far too expensive to justify mass production, especially now that the urgent, existential need for armored vehicles had evaporated with the peace. But in 1919, one of the tanks received an unexpected chance to prove its worth. In Italy's North African colonies, local populations rose up against the colonial administration. The situation in Libya grew so serious that military intervention was deemed necessary to suppress the revolt and restore control over the territory. The High Command made the decision to send at least one Fiat 2000 to Libya, though here the historical sources begin to diverge. Some assert that only the second prototype made the journey to Africa. Others insist that both tanks participated in the North African campaign. The tank, or tanks, became part of an expeditionary corps dispatched to capture the city of Garan, which was held by rebel forces. The operation was a success, and Italian troops recaptured the city. Yet the precise details of the Fiat 2000's role in this battle remain a complete mystery. Not a single detailed combat report has survived, nor are there any eyewitness accounts that could tell us exactly how the tanks were used. Did they fire their guns at the enemy? How effective could they possibly have been in the alien conditions of the African desert? This entire operation is shrouded in a fog of uncertainty, and historians still debate the tank's actual contribution to the Libyan campaign. Decades later, in a bizarre historical footnote, the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi would issue a series of postage stamps, and there, immortalized on a small perforated square of paper, was the unmistakable silhouette of the Fiat 2000. It is a strange and silent testament to a machine that arrived too late for the world's greatest war, and whose only taste of combat remains locked away, a secret kept by the desert sands. It serves as a powerful reminder that the purpose of a weapon is not always found on the battlefield, but sometimes in the long, quiet echo of what might have been. In the grand, often manipulated tapestry of history, some threads are intentionally woven from fiction. Consider a peculiar Italian postage stamp, one commemorating a battle fought in 1913. The image is heroic, depicting soldiers and a formidable war machine. But there is a glaring inconsistency, a deliberate tear in the fabric of time. The machine is the Fiat 2000, a tank whose designs wouldn't even be conceived for another 2 years, long before the very concept of the tank had a name in the lexicon of war. This small piece of paper is a testament to how propaganda can bend reality, creating an alternate past to serve a political future. After a tour in Africa, the fates of the two Fiat 2000 prototypes began to diverge. They were titans of their time, the first true heavy tanks of Italy, but their shared story was coming to an end. The last known photograph of the first prototype is dated 1924. When military officials conducted a thorough inventory of equipment and armaments in 1925, and again in 1926, the ledgers listed only a single tank. The second prototype was verifiably active well into the 1930s, leading historians to a grim but logical conclusion. Its twin had been unceremoniously sent to the scrapyard. Yet there exists no direct documentary proof, no final order for its demise. It simply vanished from the books. The lone survivor, however, continued its service, albeit in a radically new capacity. In 1934, the machine underwent a significant modernization. Its forward-facing machine guns were stripped away, and in their place, engineers mounted two powerful 37mm cannons, dramatically increasing its firepower. This upgraded Fiat became less a weapon of war and more an instrument of influence. It was used to train the next generation of tank crews and, more visibly, paraded at propaganda events. The colossal vehicle was meant to be a rolling embodiment of Italian military might, a spectacle designed to inspire awe and loyalty in the public. From the battlefield, but from history itself. After 1934, it evaporates from every known document and report. Military archives fall silent. There is no order for its decommissioning, no paperwork detailing a transfer to another unit, no certificate of its destruction or recycling. A 40-ton giant of steel and rivets ceases to be mentioned in any official capacity, as if it had never truly existed at all. Historians are left with only theories, whispers in the silent halls of the archives. The most probable, and perhaps most prosaic explanation, is that the tank was sent to the smelter. In the prelude to a new, more terrible global conflict, Italy was desperately ramping up production of modern armored vehicles. An obsolete monster from the First World War held no combat value, but its 40 tons of high-quality steel were an invaluable resource, ready to be melted down and reborn as new tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. By the time the Second World War began, the Fiat 2000 was no longer listed on any inventory of the Italian army. Other possibilities, however, persist. Some researchers speculate the tank might have been destroyed during an Allied bombing raid, its colossal frame mangled beyond recognition amidst the rubble of a barracks or a factory. Others imagine a more solitary end, simply abandoned and forgotten in some vast military warehouse where it slowly surrendered to the elements, its iron hide turning to a cascade of rust. A more romantic theory suggests it was repurposed one last time, perhaps as an immobile gun emplacement, a static pillbox somewhere on the coast, dug in to defend against a possible Allied landing. There it might have waited, a silent sentinel staring out at the sea, its final battle never to come, before being unceremoniously buried or scrapped after the war. Ultimately, we do not know. A machine built to be unforgettable has been forgotten. Its final fate a ghost story told in the language of missing files and archival silence. It serves as a stark reminder that even the most immense creations of man can be utterly consumed by time, leaving not a wreck, but a question mark. Some say it was simply buried, along with other obsolete fortifications, its steel hide surrendered to the silent depths. But these are just stories, guesses unsupported by a single shred of documentary evidence. The final fate of Italy's great steel beast remains a mystery. In the end, it hardly mattered. The entire concept of the super-heavy tank was proving itself to be an evolutionary dead end, a cul-de-sac in the development of armored warfare. The brutal lessons of the First World War were clear. The future belonged not to lumbering giants, but to lighter, faster, and more maneuverable machines. The very next tank to enter Italian service would be the Fiat 3000, a licensed copy of the French Renault FT, weighing a mere 5.5 tons. It was the complete antithesis of its gargantuan predecessor, a small, nimble machine capable of crossing difficult terrain and achieving a respectable speed. The Fiat 2000 remains in history, as a bold but ultimately failed experiment. It was born in an era when designers did not yet truly understand what an ideal tank should be. They tried to compensate for this lack of experience by simply increasing size and piling on more and more weaponry. The engineers at Fiat believed that the bigger the tank, the better protected it would be, the more intimidating it would appear to the enemy. But reality proved to be a harsh instructor. The war did not demand mobile fortresses. It demanded swift assault vehicles, machines capable of tearing through defensive lines and exploiting the breakthrough. And yet, within this flawed behemoth lay a truly revolutionary concept. Its design, specifically the fully rotating turret, was so far ahead of its time it seemed to belong to a different decade entirely. Most tanks of the Great War had their main armaments fixed in side-mounted sponsons or in limited traverse casemates. This forced the entire colossal machine to pivot and turn just to bring its guns to bear on a new target. The Fiat 2000, with its dome-shaped cupola capable of a full 360-degree rotation, anticipated the classic tank layout that would become the absolute standard for decades to come. But this one progressive idea was implemented on a platform that was, in every other respect, a dead end. The project perfectly demonstrates the problem that all nations faced at the dawn of the armored age. Creating a tank from scratch, with no prior experience and no understanding of the basic principles, inevitably led to mistakes. Every country learned from its own blunders, built its own flawed prototypes, and gradually, painfully, felt its way toward the right path. For Italy, the Fiat 2000 became just that, a textbook, a costly but vital lesson in what not to do. Decades passed, and the tank slowly transformed into a legend. Old soldiers would sometimes recall the giant machine, but for most people, it had never existed at all. Photographs of the tank languished in archives, appearing only rarely in specialized publications for enthusiasts of military history. It seemed the Fiat 2000 was destined to remain a curious footnote, a forgotten episode from a distant past, known only to a narrow circle of historians. And then, in the year 2017, an incredible event occurred, breathing new life into this forgotten story. An Italian group of military restoration enthusiasts decided to bring the giant back. History, it seems, is never truly over. Sometimes it is merely sleeping, waiting for a new generation to awaken its ghosts. In the quiet workshops of northern Italy, a team of dedicated historical technicians, known as Spa Militare, made a discovery that would alter the course of their lives. They unearthed a ghost from a forgotten war, a full 1-to-1 scale wooden model of a tank. This was the real thing. But now, this timber phantom presented the restorers with a unique, almost insane opportunity to resurrect a legend in steel and fire. The machine in question was the Fiat 2000, Italy's first and only heavy tank, a titan of the Great War. An ambitious crowdfunding campaign was launched, not merely to build a static model, but to forge a fully functional, living replica with a beating heart, a working engine, and all its intricate systems. The call went out, and from across Italy, and even beyond its borders, people responded. They were drawn in by the romance of the project, by the desire to see this unique piece of their heritage claw its way back from oblivion. The funds trickled in, slowly but surely. And with each donation, the dream hardened into resolve. The restorers began their painstaking work. The process would consume 3 years of their lives, 3 years of intensive, obsessive labor. They became archaeologists of engineering, poring over brittle, century-old blueprints, analyzing the few grainy photographs that survived the ravages of time and consulting with historians to fill in the countless gaps. Every single component had to be fabricated by hand or custom ordered. There is no catalog, no spare parts warehouse for a machine that vanished from the earth nearly 100 years ago. Vast sheets of armored WMs were assembled with a jeweler's precision, each gear and lever falling into place. The turret, the machine's formidable crown, was engineered to rotate just as its ancestors had. Then, in the year 2020, the work was finally complete. A world grappling with a new crisis was given a chance to see the Fiat 2000 in all its brutalist glory, resurrected almost a century after the last original had been scrapped and lost to history. The finished replica surpassed all expectations. iTraverse, and every mechanical system functioned as designed. In place of the rare Fiat A12 aviation motor, the restorers installed a modern engine, carefully calibrated to mimic the power and sound profile of the original. And as it roared to life for the first time, the 40-ton behemoth awoke, shuddering as it exhaled characteristic plumes of exhaust gas. Its first public outing drew a crowd of hundreds, spectators who simply could not believe what their eyes were seeing. Moving before them was a true ghost of the First World War, a machine from an epoch when the very concept of the tank was just taking its first clumsy steps onto the battlefield. The creators, however, have a vision for their machine that extends beyond static exhibitions. They plan for it to star in films, to be rented for historical events and battlefield reenactments. The tank must earn its keep, generating an income that will be funneled back into the restoration of other rare examples of Italian armored heritage. It is an ambitious plan to transform historical reconstruction into a self-sustaining project, a venture that will preserve the memory of Italy's military technical legacy for generations to come. But the true story of the Fiat 2000 is not ultimately about this magnificent copy. It is rooted in the dramatic, world-changing events of a century ago. The original tank was a symbol of a transitional age, an era when old, romanticized notions of warfare collided head-on with new and terrifying technological realities. The generals of the First World War still thought in terms of fortresses and siegecraft, and so to them, the idea of a mobile, armored fortress, a rolling bastion that could cross no man's land and break the deadlock of the trenches, seemed both logical and profoundly attractive. It was a machine born from an old mind grappling with a new kind of hell, a steel testament to humanity's perpetual struggle to comprehend the very nature of the conflicts it creates. They had not yet grasped the coming truth, a truth whispered on the wind and written in the churned mud of the Somme, that the future of war would be a brutal ballet of maneuver, a contest where speed was a shield more vital than steel plate, and mobility a virtue more precious than raw firepower. In this dawning age of mechanical cavalry, the Fiat 2000 was a creature from another time. It embodied an older, more stubborn philosophy, the static defense, the unyielding fortress, now, impossibly, given tracks and an engine. The engineers who conceived it were not building a tank in the sense we understand it today. They were crafting a mobile pillbox, a land dreadnought. Its purpose was to crawl, inexorably, ahead of the advancing infantry, a 40-ton steel tortoise designed to methodically crush enemy strongpoints with its powerful artillery and a bristling array of machine guns. On paper, the logic was sound, a perfect solution for the grinding attrition of trench warfare. But in practice, the concept shattered against the unforgiving reality of its intended battlefield. The war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not fought in the fields of Flanders. It was a war in the mountains. Here, the enemy was entrenched on the commanding heights, turning every peak and ridge into an almost unassailable fortress. For the Italian soldiers, the Alpini, victory was measured in vertical feet, scrambling up narrow, treacherous paths under a murderous hail of fire. No tank, on giant, would have been physically incapable of navigating the winding mountain roads. And even if it could, it would have become a spectacular, stationary target for the Austrian artillery, which, from its high perch, could see and shell every conceivable approach. The war in the Alps was governed by entirely different rules. It was a conflict won by mountain riflemen, by climbing gear and ice axes, and by light mountain guns that could be disassembled and hauled by men and mules over the high passes. The supreme irony of the Fiat 2000's existence is that the one place on Earth where it might have proven its worth was not in Europe at all, but in the vast, open expanse of the African desert. In Libya, there were no narrow mountain trails, no sheer cliffs to halt its advance. Here, there was space for a great tank to maneuver, to bring its immense power to bear. Yet even here, its operational history dissolves into mystery and conjecture. The official records are strangely silent. Perhaps the tank simply sat at a base camp, its colossal form serving as a psychological weapon, a steel monster to awe and intimidate the local populace. It's possible it took part in bombardments, using its short-barreled howitzer to reduce the mud-brick fortifications of local rebels to dust. Or, perhaps, the story is far less glorious. Maybe the machine, plagued by the mechanical frailties of its era, broke down within the first few days and spent the entire campaign waiting for repairs that would never come. This conspicuous absence of documentation strongly suggests that the military high command was deliberately reticent about the tank's deployment. Either its performance was so profoundly disappointing that they preferred to bury the reports, or the great machine was never used in combat at all, an admission of failure too embarrassing to make after the immense investment of time and national treasure. The Italian army had spent years and a fortune to create a superweapon that, in the end, never fired a single shot in anger against a serious adversary. The fate of the first prototype is similarly shrouded in fog. Its disappearance from all records between 1924 and 1926 coincides with a period of immense political upheaval in Italy. These were the years the fascists seized power, and with them came a fervent desire to forge a new, modern army, purging anything deemed obsolete. It is entirely plausible that the first Fiat 2000, a relic of a failed strategy from a bygone war, fell victim to this ideological housecleaning, sent to the foundry to be melted down alongside the other ghosts of the Great War. It stands as a silent steel testament not to victory or defeat, but to a misplaced vision, a reminder that the most fearsome weapon is not always the one with the thickest armor, but the one built for the war that is, not the war that was. The second prototype, however, would cling to existence for a while longer, precisely because it was repurposed for the theater of propaganda. Under the rising fascist regime, a spectacle of military might was paramount, and this steel behemoth was the perfect centerpiece for parades and public displays of power. Its machine guns were stripped out, replaced with heavier cannons, not for combat effectiveness, but for a more intimidating silhouette. It was even used in training exercises, allowing infantry to practice coordination with armor, even if that armor was hopelessly, almost tragically, obsolete. But as the world lurched towards a second global conflict, Italy began a frantic, desperate race to rearm. The old giant finally lost any semblance of value. The new Italian M and L series tanks were lighter, faster, and far better armed. The Fiat 2000 had become a gargantuan anachronism, a steel ghost consuming space and precious resources. The decision to scrap it was merely a matter of time, a time that arrived in the mid-1930s. Had just one of these machines survived, it would now be a priceless artifact, one of the rarest tanks in existence. But history, as it so often does, proved unsentimental. Today, we can only glimpse this astonishing machine through faded photographs, technical drawings, and a single modern replica. It remains a powerful symbol of an era when humanity was relearning the art of war, making grand mistakes, and forging machines that seemed invincible on paper, yet proved utterly powerless on the battlefield.